Adobe's format lock-in is a criticism that Adobe has had for decades. As programs like Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, and later Adobe InDesign became industry standards, their file formats such as PSDs, .ai files, and InDesign projects also became standard. Adobe benefited from this being hard to leave. If your whole workflow depends on layered Photoshop files, for example, switching becomes painful even if alternatives exist. It's not that other software couldn't open Adobe files at all, but often not perfectly, especially with advanced features, which meant that the safest place for Adobe work was usually Adobe. And then this got much bigger with Adobe Creative Cloud in 2013, because now it wasn't just file format dependence, but it was also subscriptions on top of that. And that's when people started making the criticism a lot more aggressively, especially around the idea that if you stop paying, then access to parts of your workflow gets harder. And to be fair, Adobe software became dominant partly because it was genuinely very good, but people have always argued that some of that dominance also comes from leaving being costly, and of course because people will blindly continue using the industry standard, and the fact that Adobe's formats are unique to it makes using Adobe kind of like a toxic relationship, where you will just lose parts of your work if you switch to something else. The shift from buying Adobe software outright to paying for Adobe Creative Cloud subscriptions is probably Adobe's biggest controversy. For years, the deal was that you bought Adobe Photoshop or the full Creative Suite, maybe paid a lot up front, but you owned that version and could keep using it for as long as you wanted. Then in 2013, Adobe announced that Creative Suite 6 would be the last major release, and future development was moving to subscriptions, or in other words, killing permanent ownership, and that's why people got so angry. It wasn't just about paying monthly, although that was a problem too, but people hated the idea that their tools were now rented, especially because so much work, again, was in Adobe file formats. People started worrying that if they stopped paying, they'd lose access to all of that work. And then what made the criticism worse is that some of the fears people had actually did happen. There was a big Creative Cloud outage where people got locked out of their software that they were paying for. Adobe obviously argued subscriptions meant faster updates and a better model overall, and financially for Adobe it absolutely worked. But for users, this never really stopped being controversial, especially whenever the subscription prices go up, which they often do. Performance and bloat is a long-running criticism of Adobe that isn't really tied to one scandal, but it became a big part of Adobe's reputation. Programs like Adobe Photoshop were always heavy, people kind of accepted that. It was doing things few other programs could do. But over time, criticism shifted from this needs a lot of power to why does this feel so overloaded, which is then why people began calling it bloated. As Photoshop and especially Premiere Pro piled on decades of features, people started saying Adobe kept layering new things onto old foundations instead of even simplifying anything. And so the launch times felt slower, memory use would keep going up alongside just random background processes, and Premiere in particular got a reputation for crashes, weird performance issues, and seemed to run worse with each version. Creative Cloud actually added to this problem because now it wasn't just the apps people complained about, it was all the background Adobe stuff too, like syncing, update services, cloud hooks, just a huge amount going on. But to be fair, Adobe has spent years trying to improve all of this, and plenty of users think modern versions are much better than they were before. Adobe has had a lot of problems with buggy updates that can actually break parts of the software, and this really became a bigger issue in the Adobe Creative Cloud era because before subscriptions, updates were very occasional. You might stay on one version for years. But once updates became more constant, people started to avoid them and never updated during a project. Especially with Premiere Pro, people would update and suddenly plugins stop behaving properly or exports act differently, the media goes weird or GPU issues show up, or a project made in a new version doesn't work properly going backwards, so the advice of just roll back wouldn't even be a fix-all. And this wasn't just Premiere, but basically every other Adobe software, which was enough that a lot of professionals started treating brand new Adobe releases with suspicion and waiting for what people called the safe build. And at this point, people adapted and basically expect that something might break and end up planning around that. So if Adobe breaks your project, a lot of users would actually put the blame on themselves for that because they just can't think of switching to an alternative. Killing Adobe Flash Player was both necessary but very controversial at the same time, because for a lot of people, Flash wasn't just some software but was literally part of the internet itself. Old browser games, animations, interactive websites, early videos, huge parts of online culture ran through Flash. The problems had been building for years though. Flash had this reputation for security holes, crashes, performance issues, all of that. Then in 2010, Steve Jobs published thoughts on Flash and basically declared war on it, arguing it was unreliable and wrong for mobile, and Apple went ahead without native Flash support. Then as web tech moved forward towards HTML5, Flash started to become old infrastructure. Adobe slowly started backing away, ended Flash development for mobile, and even renamed Flash Professional into Adobe Animate. And then in 2017, Adobe Adobe and basically the whole tech industry announced Flash would die by the end of 2020. Not that it would stop being updated, but that in 2021 Flash content was actively being blocked from running. That obviously upset a lot of people because so much internet history was tied to it, and so those old games and other projects just broke unless people saved them. So even though killing Flash made sense, some people still see it as Adobe helping build this huge creative medium and then just walking away from it, which led to its eventual death. Adobe cancellation fees are very stupid because obviously nobody likes to feel trapped by having to pay money to exit, but also that they don't really make sense to have for a digital product. And the whole thing really centered around Adobe's annual paid monthly plans, which a lot of people assumed meant normal monthly subscriptions, when really you were committing to a year and could get hit with a pretty brutal cancellation fee if you left early. And that's where people got angry because many users felt that they didn't fully realize what they had signed up for until they tried to cancel. Then those screenshots started going viral of people being asked to pay hundreds of dollars just to leave, which became quite mainstream and people genuinely started calling it a hostage fee. Places like gyms do this because they have to pay and maintain equipment under the assumption that people will stay long enough, which makes sense, but digital products don't have anything like this. All they spend money on is improving the product and servers, but as does literally every other software. But the biggest critique wasn't even that Adobe is expensive, but that Adobe may be designing this to be confusing. That's a very different accusation. And they ended up in legal trouble and just last month ended up paying $75 million and adding better disclosures of the fees. The Adobe accessing user content controversy in 2024 became one of Adobe's probably biggest trust crises because this was right in the middle of peak AI paranoia. It started when people opening apps like Photoshop and Premiere Pro got hit with updated terms they had to accept, and users started noticing small text saying Adobe could access user content through automated and manual methods. And because everyone was already worrying about companies training AI on creative work, people immediately thought that Adobe was training AI on their projects. And people use Adobe for NDA client files, unreleased commercial work, private artwork, basically anything. And the section talking about manual reviews also added questions of whether Adobe employees could review project files. All of this was, again, hidden somewhere in terms of services and wasn't actually shown clearly as a standalone notification. Adobe had to scramble with clarification saying customer work wasn't being used to train generative AI, then they actually rewrote the terms again after backlash. Apparently, it was just that they would start to review content to check for any potential illegal media, either via AI or with human moderators, which seems to mean that indeed your files can be reviewed by Adobe at any time. Obviously, they'd have to be flagged by the AI first for illegal content or whatever, but I feel like that is just as bad as the initial AI training accusation. The failed Adobe Figma merger was supposed to be one of the biggest software deals ever. From the moment Adobe announced the $20 billion price tag in 2022, people were already questioning it, and a lot of people thought that the number was just absurd. But what made their reaction so hostile is people didn't see this as Adobe buying a useful product, but they saw it as Adobe trying to buy the competitor, threatening Adobe XD, because by that point Figma had become the future of collaborative design, while XD was clearly losing momentum, and there was genuine concern over Figma becoming slower, more expensive, or getting swallowed into Creative Cloud, and since Adobe failed with XD, what's stopping them from doing the same to Figma? Even regulators from Europe and the UK started getting involved in this potential deal because of just how much bad attention it was getting. And then in late 2023, it ended completely, with Adobe walking away with nothing and paying $1 billion breakup fee. This all actually ended up helping Figma, both the money of course, and the fact that Adobe was willing to pay the $20 billion made its position in the market much stronger than it was before, while Adobe XD sort of died and became a legacy product. This was quite a fun video to work on. If you enjoyed, please do hype and share the video, you know, all of that. Leave a comment on whether you have any experience with Adobe, and even if you don't, just what you think of all of this in general, and thank you for watching.